Good morning. Haven't had a chance to speak to you all. My name is Jennifer Spradley, and I represent Ms. Schenecker. You were selected because you all agreed that you could be fair and impartial. And what you're going to hear as you endeavor on this jury service is you're going to hear about a tale of two mothers. You're going to hear about Ms. Schenecker and her mother, Pat Powers. You're going to hear that when the police responded on January 28, 2011, it was a response to a call made by Pat Powers. She received an email from her daughter that concerned her. She forwarded that to Parker Schenecker, Julie's husband. And then she calls the police. And when the police respond on January 28, 2011, they respond to do a welfare check. And you're going to hear from those officers that responded. Officer Copulus, who responds, Officer Noble, who responds, and eventually Sergeant Pryor, who responds. When they come to the front door, they knock, ring the doorbell, and they don't get an answer. But they look through the glass door, and they see the back sliding glass door is open. So they go around to the back of the house, where they find Julie Schenecker laying out on the back patio in her robe. You're going to hear that this was a cool January morning when they respond. They thought it was unusual that she was out on the patio. She appeared to be sleeping for a while, or passed out is what the officers will tell you. And they called to her. You're going to hear from Officer Noble how that investigation quickly turned from a welfare check on Ms. Schenecker to a homicide investigation. You're going to hear what they discovered in the home. You're going to hear that when Ms. Schenecker was spoken to by law enforcement officers, that she was unsteady on her feet, that they had to sit her on the couch, that they had to hold her up. And when they asked her about her children, because her mother was concerned based on Ms. Schenecker's email, they discovered the bodies of Calix and Bo Schenecker. They discovered the body of Calix Schenecker, which Ms. Schenecker will tell law enforcement she tucked into bed. Calix was in her bed, tucked in. And you're going to hear where Bo Schenecker was located. He's in the passenger side of a Honda Odyssey SUV parked in the garage of the Schenecker home, also tucked in a blanket. And you're going to hear the words of Julie Schenecker that she tried to pick Bo up and put him in her bed, the place where he slept the soundest with her when Parker was out of town. But she couldn't lift him. You're going to hear when Ms. Schenecker was there in the home, they took her to the police station and they questioned her. How the welfare check turned into a homicide investigation. The law enforcement at that time never checked on how Ms. Schenecker was doing. They never cleared her with the hospital. And they speak to her and they interview her. And at the scene, you're not going to have any video from law enforcement, from the vehicles, to see how Ms. Schenecker appeared at the time when the police responded. But you are going to hear what she sounded like on January 28, 2011. And you're going to hear the words that she says and the answers that she gives to law enforcement. You're going to hear about how Ms. Schenecker's relationship with Calix was evolving. You're going to hear about her diagnosis of bipolar. You're going to hear about the medication that she was on. And you're going to hear from Ms. Schenecker the words that she says to law enforcement when they ask her, did she say anything to Calix before she shot her? And she said, I love you. You're going to hear about a woman who, after law enforcement take her to booking, ends up getting transported to Tampa General Hospital, where she's suffering from lithium and Coumadin toxicity. She had taken toxic levels. You're going to hear that after she fired the shots that ended up killing her children, that she reloaded the gun to kill herself. But after she took those pills, she passed out. You're going to hear from law enforcement how she asked the officers at the scene, can I have my gun and finish the job? Can I borrow your gun? You're going to hear the state that she was in. And we're going to try to explain to you how something like this could happen. Why a mother would shoot her children. And in order to do that, you have to go back to the beginning. And you're going to hear about Ms. Schenecker. We're going to introduce you to our client, and you're going to hear it from her own words. You're going to hear it from her ex-husband, Parker Schenecker. What he describes as an all-American family with a sick member. And she's a sick member. You're going to hear how she was born in Iowa. She has a younger sister and an older brother. And they moved to Los Angeles at some point, and you're going to hear how at 6 years old, she was molested. You're going to hear about how that person was prosecuted and how Ms. Schenecker at 6 years old testified in a trial. Her family eventually moved back to Iowa, and you're going to hear how she excelled in sports and graduated high school there, ultimately ending up enrolling in college and being a student athlete. You're going to hear that before the mental illness took hold of her, she had a productive life. You're going to hear that she was again sexually assaulted at age 17. After she finishes college, she enrolls in the Army, and she goes on an intensive study of the Russian language. She has intense courses for a year. And she becomes a Russian debriefer. She speaks to defectors and finds out information from them that they are willing to pass along. She stays in the military for 10 years, and that's where she meets and falls in love with Parker Schenecker. And you're going to hear about that. You're going to hear how Ms. Schenecker was involved in all-Army volleyball and how Parker Schenecker ended up playing, that she was coaching, and that she was a good soldier. And she was a good athlete. But you're going to hear about those 10 years in the military, how they ended up getting married, how they moved from location to location, and you're going to hear about that. And you're going to hear about the signs that Parker Schenecker saw after they were first married, when they started living together. What Mr. Schenecker describes as the drumbeat of their relationship. Ms. Schenecker's high energy levels, Ms. Schenecker's low energy levels. how when she's depressed, she stays in bed for weeks. How she goes to psychiatrists in every location that they're transferred, year after year after year. Managing the family. How she leaves the military after 10 years, partly because the depression was kicking in and she couldn't handle it anymore, in part because she wanted to start a family. She knew that Parker was going to be career military, and she wanted to have children. And you're going to hear that she wanted to have 6 children, and Parker wanted to have 2. How Calix was born in Germany, Bo was born in Hawaii, and after Bo was born, Parker Schenecker had a vasectomy. So she didn't have any more children. But you're going to hear about how she raised her children. She always wanted to have children. The time that she had the children, she was in her 30s. And she cared for them. She was able to be a stay-at-home mom. They made enough money for her to stay home with the children. And she participated in their lives fully. She breastfed them. She went to their sports. When Calix was younger, she started sewing and making money with that, making cribs and sheets, and bringing Calix along with her. She wrote down different ways to say encouraging words to her children. She wanted to teach them to be independent, worldly kids, and they were. You're going to hear from Parker Schenecker how, as they moved from location to location, depending on what his position was, dictated how much he was around the home, what the hours were. You're going to hear about the life of a military wife with a husband who's rising in the ranks with 2 children overseas and in different locations without her family being around. And you're going to hear about when times got tough or they needed help, that Parker's mother would often come, Nancy Schenecker, and you're going to hear about her. How at different times when they lived in Hawaii and when they lived in the United States, that Nancy Schenecker lived near them and helped out with the children. And you're going to hear about how the disease transformed Ms. Schenecker's life. You're going to hear about how she checked herself in to the National Institute of Health for 9 months when she was living in the States, because she became so depressed she could not take Calix to kindergarten. You're going to hear about her diagnosis, and you're going to learn a lot about mental illness. You're going to hear that she's had a couple different diagnoses. Some will say she's bipolar 1 with psychotic features. Some people will say schizoaffective disorder. But they will all tell you how difficult her mental illness is to treat. How even when she was in a hospital for 9 months, they had a hard time stabilizing her with the medication. And you'll hear about the medication that she was on, how it changed, what the side effects were, and how she dealt with that. You're going to hear about a thought disorder that she has, about the mania, about the depression, and how that translated to her life. How at times she would get into projects, how she would do different business ventures, how she ended up gambling, buying cars, or staying in bed for weeks and weeks upon time. And the toll that it took on this all-American family. With her chronic mental illness, you'll hear that Calyx started to become more of a parent. That she would take care of things. And eventually, like any teenager, began to rebel a little bit and was frustrated with dealing with my client. Dealing with a mother who wouldn't get out of bed. Dealing with a mother that wouldn't remember conversations that they just had. Dealing with a mother who she didn't believe was a good role model for her. And you're going to hear how things started a downward spiral from September, the end of the summer in 2010. You're going to become familiar with tardive dyskinesia and its effects. How when someone takes long-term antipsychotic medication, how sometimes that affects their movements. They shake, their mouth moves. And you're going to hear from Parker Schenecker about how that resulted and what happened with Julie Schenecker. You're going to hear what Parker describes as things unraveling around the time she started exhibiting symptoms of tardive dyskinesia. How she had a steady decline in her depression. How she was deeply, deeply hurt by the deterioration that was happening with her relationship with Calyx. You're going to hear about some of the things that Calyx would say to Ms. Schenecker. Not liking that she smoked, calling her mentally unstable, not wanting to live in the home, telling her that she's useless, telling her that she'll never amount to anything and that she's not her mother. And you're going to hear how those words rolled around in the mind of someone who is chronically mentally ill. But you're also going to hear that it was the words and not her daughter that upset her. You're going to hear her describe Calyx Schenecker in her journal as her soulmate. You're going to hear that she lists Calyx Schenecker as a support to her, somebody that will hold her accountable. And you're going to hear that right after Thanksgiving time, how Ms. Schenecker comes out of treatment and goes into her bed in November of 2010. And she stays in bed. You're going to hear what the experts will describe as a severe depressed episode that she is in. That her energy is non-existent. You're going to hear what Parker describes as the first time he's seen her like this for this long in 20 years. And before she goes into treatment in November, she makes a phone call to the familiar person that helps her out, Nancy Schenecker. And Nancy Schenecker, like a great grandmother and supporter to her son and his family, comes to stay with the family while she's in treatment. You're going to hear that when Ms. Schenecker gets out of treatment and she goes to bed, that she's having constant suicidal thoughts. And unlike the drumbeat of their relationship, you're going to hear that this is a black hole she cannot get out of. That she's in bed and no one is coming to check on her, and she stays in bed because the all-American family that is frustrated with their sick member is moving on, and you're going to hear how they continued with their lives. And when Parker Schenecker brings Miss Schenecker home, you're going to hear about some of the traveling that he did and how he ultimately ended up being deployed in January of 2011, leaving Miss Schenecker in the home with their 2 children, alone. And how Miss Schenecker, the person who had always wanted to commit suicide, was determined to commit suicide. And you're going to hear about her journey to do that. You're going to hear from our experts and the state's experts, and you're also going to hear from Ms. Schenecker's psychiatrist when this was going on, Dr. Obregon, and her therapist, Elizabeth Marsh. You're going to hear that she was still going to her psychiatrist in December of 2011. You're going to hear that Calyx was doing some individual counseling, and that the family also participated in counseling at the end of December, and you're going to hear how that went. But most of all, you're going to hear from Ms. Schenecker through her statement, through her journal, through her conversations with the experts. You're going to be able to see for yourself and read for yourself the thoughts that she had when this was happening. You're going to hear her telling the story about how this happened. You're going to hear how a mother of 2 beautiful children did something that tore her to the soul. What she describes as the worst thing she could have ever done. The unimaginable. And you'll hear how a mother and a former soldier lost her battle with her chronic mental illness that took everything from her, including her children. And after you listen to all the evidence, and you determine what the facts are in this case, we are going to ask you to find Ms. Schenecker not guilty by reason of insanity. Thank you.
At this juncture, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to send you out for what will be just about a 15-minute comfort break. As I send you out, I'll remind you now, as I will at every break, that we're in the course of trial. You're not to discuss this case among yourselves. You're not to discuss it with anyone else. You're not to allow anyone to discuss it with you or in your presence. Not to speak at all with the attorneys, witnesses, defendant about any subject to your deliberations are finished. Not to read or listen to any reports about this case from any source whatsoever. not to do any research, gather information, or communicate about this case or the people or places involved through any means, including all those electronic devices. We'll send you out for a brief break.
All